Hello, my name is Dr. Kara Ng, and I am a Presidential Fellow in Organisational Psychology at Alliance Manchester Business School at the University of Manchester in the UK. Thank you for inviting me to give this Africa and Science lecture, where I will be talking about my research on workplace bullying and its bystanders. So the main argument that I hope to present is that bystanders can enact a variety of behaviors when confronted with workplace bullying. And I want to kind of explain the how and the why in which these behaviors are enacted. So just to provide a bit of context to this presentation, I'll be offering a narrative explanation of a 2019-2020 paper that my colleagues Karen Niven, Helge Hol, and I published in a journal called Human Relations. It is a theoretical piece, which means that we're kind of offering our own conceptual proposals and explanations as to why certain phenomena occur. And in this case, we'll be focusing on the phenomena of workplace bullying. So I'm sure many people have heard the term workplace bullying or workplace harassment, either in the mainstream media or in their own workplace experiences. And in the past few decades, there's been a real push for the mainstream management and organizations to take workplace bullying seriously as a social issue. So as you can see on my slides, I've taken some recent news clippings that highlight the kind of the prevalence of workplace bullying and how it has profound effects on one's mental health, even leading, in extreme cases to suicide. And despite the kind of focus on mental health that we've had in many societies, the more acceptance and destigmatization of mental health, it seems that workplace bullying claims are still quite high and appear to be increasing over time. So let's talk a bit about workplace bullying and how we understand it, because it is a term with a lot of implicit understanding, but it's important to have an academic definition of it. The most commonly accepted academic definition is by Ståle Einarsson and colleagues, and they define workplace bullying as harassing, offending, socially excluding someone, or negatively affecting someone's work tasks. Bullying has to occur repeatedly and regularly over a period of time. Bullying is an escalating process in the course of which the person, the target, confronted ends up in an inferior position and becomes the target of systematic negative social acts. So it's quite a long definition, but then I'll come back to kind of parse it later on. But you can see that this is quite a general definition. It doesn't talk about specific types of behaviors. And that is one of the really interesting things about workplace bullying, because it is a very subjective phenomenon. It can encompass a variety of behaviors, from verbal acts, for example, yelling at someone or belittling them, or kind of making comments that that a target may deem as socially inappropriate. And bullying can also encompass more physical acts of mistreatment, like aggression or even violence, as well as social acts like ostracism, gossiping, or social exclusion. So it really is a very subjective type of phenomenon, which makes it more interesting, but also more difficult to study empirically. As one can imagine, workplace bullying has really profound effects on targets' mental health and physical health. So there have been so many studies that have consistently shown that prolonged exposure to workplace bullying can lead to greater anxiety, depression, greater irritability, and psychosomatic complaints. So kind of physical complaints that don't really have a medical or biological reason. And in extreme cases, workplace bullying has led to suicidal ideation, or in the worst case, following through with the suicidal ideation, with some targets ending their lives tragically. There are also several cases where targets experience symptoms similar to post-traumatic stress disorder, getting flashbacks and being triggered by certain events because the bullying that they experienced was so traumatic. And there may be an argument in some more cynical circles that victims of bullying are just like weak, or they're just not resilient enough. However, this argument has been disproven in recent research, which shows that persistent exposure to workplace bullying will negatively affect targets' well-being, regardless of how resilient they are or what kind of personal resources they have to defend themselves. So it's that drip effect that can affect people regardless of who they are. And at the very baseline level for organizations, there are real financial and organizational costs to bullying, especially if bullying is endemic within an organization. So there have been quite a few studies that show that bullying is associated with high levels of turnover or turnover intention, lower productivity, lower group morale, which all in turn have financial costs to an organization, not counting maybe the legal costs or the negative PR and loss of business associated with a bullying case, for example, if it becomes publicized. So I want to talk about workplace bullying research in an African context. I know Africa is a whole continent, so it's very difficult to kind of say this is applicable to a whole host of countries. As with many psychological constructs and psychological research, most work has been done in the Anglo sphere or in Northern European context. So the way that we understand workplace bullying is often constrained by the culture, the cultural factors, that the cultural settings that they're in. And so we don't really have a strong understanding of how workplace bullying looks in non-European or non-Western European countries, like, for example, some African countries. What existing research there is in Africa has been mostly conducted in South Africa, which ignores the whole host of other kind of culture clusters. But a global review conducted several years ago suggests that sub-Saharan African countries, so the kind of the culture cluster, show a lower tolerance for workplace bullying due to the fact that there is a greater emphasis culturally on being fair, generous, and caring. So that is quite reassuring, but this is only one study, and we don't know, for example, if bullying looks different in certain cultures, or it's interpreted differently, or has different outcomes. So it's something that is really worth expanding upon in the future when we want to apply research and theory into non-weird, non-Western countries. So as I said, I would go back to this very long definition of bullying because I really want to highlight what makes bullying unique from other forms of mistreatment like incivility or aggression or abusive supervision. So as you can see on this slide, I've highlighted certain parts of the definition that I gave just a few slides ago. And these the highlighted bits kind of emphasize the key feature, what we call the key features of bullying, so what differentiates it. So workplace bullying is different from other forms of mistreatment because it is frequent, so it's repeated and regular. That differentiates it from a one-off act of aggression. For example, if I'm very stressed and I yell at a colleague, it's obviously unpleasant and wrong, but it's not that kind of long-term persistent process. Bullying is also generally an escalating phenomenon. So because it does occur quite persistently and over a long period of time, it often gets worse and spirals to the point where the target feels as though they are increasingly subject to the perpetrator's whim. So there's that increasing power imbalance, and often the target will feel further isolated as colleagues become willingly or unwillingly dragged into the bullying dynamic, and the target becomes further isolated, which can lead to behavioral changes that may serve to further fuel the bullying behaviors. So for example, if I become more withdrawn and less productive at work because I just feel like I'm so affected by the bullying, that may serve to justify some of the perpetrators' negative behaviors. And my colleagues may end up thinking, well, they're not really a good, Cara is not really a good performer, so she may deserve this type of mistreatment. So these are some of the key features that we argue differentiate bullying from other forms of mistreatment. I want to focus here on this, summarizing this definition and say that, these key features suggest that bullying is something that's dynamic, so it changes over time and it occurs over a long period of time, and that it involves other people. So that is what I want to be focusing on. And a lot of researchers in the past few years have taken these key features and have moved towards trying to understand bullying through different perspectives, which is how bystander research kind of comes in. Because we acknowledge now that bullying is a social process that often occurs within groups and teams. So as I've said in the last slide, other people become willingly or unwillingly involved because workplaces are inherently very social arenas, and oftentimes mistreatment doesn't occur in kind of just an empty room. It can often occur in front of other people. So there's this focus now on what these other people do, what these other people think, and how they can act to worsen or improve the bullying situation for the target. So we call these other people bystanders or third parties. Originally, they were kind of conceptualized as secondary victims, so people who were just very passive and were just kind of negatively affected by the bullying, but less so than the target. And while this is true to a large extent, there's also been a lot of research, especially in qualitative studies, that show that bystanders can may actually agree with the bullying or act in ways that serve to worsen the bullying for the target. And we don't really understand that because we've tended to reduce bystanders to kind of passive victims by proxy. So what my colleagues and I really want to do is move beyond this and to find ways to understand the variety of behaviors that can be enacted. So what we've done is taken a framework by some colleagues in Australia to conceptualize the different types of bystander responses to workplace bullying. So Paul and colleagues developed a framework where they conceptualize what bystander responses along 2 dimensions. So the first dimension is active to passive. So the y-axis on the image that I've given, and that is the extent to which the behaviors are proactive or seek to address the bullying, or the extent to which they don't. The y-axis, so the horizontal dimension is destructive to constructive. So this dimension explains the extent to which the bystander behaviors seek to worsen or improve the situation for the target, respectively. So from these 2 dimensions, you have 4 general types of bystander responses. So first you have active destructive, which is the worst type of bystander response. So it actively seeks to worsen the bullying for the target. This can include, behaviors such as laughing along with the bully's remarks or setting up situations where the perpetrator come up in qualitative research, so it's quite discouraging, but these do exist. You have passive destructive behavior. So these are bystander responses that don't seek to improve the situation for the target and are quite and have that level of inaction. So these behaviors are I would define as a typical bystander effect response. So maybe not doing anything, leaving the room when the mistreatment is happening. And these responses can be quite common Then you have passive constructive responses. So these are responses that don't directly seek to address the bullying situation. So they're not kind of active in that sense, but they try to make the situation better for targets. So these are things like maybe listening to the target or showing sympathy to them when or after mistreatment has occurred. So it's trying to make the target feel better, but it's not actively doing anything to the bullying situation. And then finally, you have active constructive responses, which are kind of the ideal response that organizations, practitioners want to encourage in bystanders. So these are responses that actively seek to improve the bullying situation for the target. So this can include intervention behaviors like standing up for the target or reporting the behaviors to human resources or supervisors or something like that. So we have these 4 general types of responses. And what my colleagues and I have done in our paper is to basically put a really complicated model in to explain how what predicts each, what appraisals predict each type of response and what are the consequences of each response. So I'll go through this quite complicated model step by step. So first, we'll be talking about what appraisals or what kind of thought processes lead to the 4 bystander responses. So in this circle here. So we propose that bystanders undergo sense making, and that helps them come to a conclusion of what type of behavior to enact. So we decided to use sense making as a way to explain this decision-making process, because workplace bullying is often very, very ambiguous to outsiders. So I said earlier that workplace bullying is very subjective because it can include a whole variety of behaviors, and just organizations and social workplaces are inherently quite socially complex domains. So there are lots of different interpretations, power dynamics, and social factors that can affect the way you interpret a bullying situation, especially if you're not within that target perpetrator pairing or dyad. So it's very ambiguous and can be affected by a lot of individual, group, or social factors. We wanted to use sense making because it is so it's a concept that really embraces the idea that the world is very ambiguous. And one way to make sense of the world is to unconsciously ask yourself a series of questions that help you come to a decision or an interpretation. And sense making is very good because it acknowledges this uncertainty and the interplay between the social environment and the individual. So how all these different factors affect the way we interpret the world. So for our paper, we argued that bystanders ask themselves 3 main questions when they, subconsciously, when they witness a bullying situation. So the first question they ask themselves is whether or not the situation is serious. So we call this an appraisal of incident severity. And it's very important. And this is generally the first question we argue that bystanders ask themselves. So they ask themselves, is there a norm or moral violation? Is this something that's serious enough to warrant further consideration? And we argue that if you see something as less severe, you're more likely to give a passive destructive response. So you don't see something out of the ordinary, you don't see a moral violation, so you're more likely to not do anything. The next question we argue that bystanders ask is whether or not the target is deserving of this treatment. So this is an appraisal of victim deservingness. So for example, maybe you do acknowledge a moral violation, that something isn't necessarily right. You ask yourself, is this a justified response? Is the victim or target responsible for this behavior that's being directed at them? So if you attribute we argue that if you attribute responsibility to a target, you're more likely to enact a destructive response. This goes back to an example that I gave a few slides ago, where, for example, I become very withdrawn, my productivity or the quality of my work kind of decreases, and then someone maybe berates me for my work in a way that would generally be seen as quite inappropriate. If I as a bystander think, oh, well, this is, you know, a form of performance management, this person is not performing well, so they deserve having these words said to them. This is a type of victim deservingness appraisal, and can increase my likelihood of enacting a destructive response. The final question that bystanders ask themselves is whether or not their actions would be effective. So this is an appraisal of bystander efficacy. So even if I feel that something needs to be done, I may not feel capable or able to affect the situation, despite thinking, for example, something is not morally right and that the target, for example, does not deserve it. Maybe it's because, you know, I may appraise myself as less efficacious because maybe I don't have the social power or the formal power to make a difference, or I don't believe that my actions will ultimately result in anything helpful. For example, if I report to human resources and I don't have a very strong belief in human resources being able to do anything, I will feel less efficacious. And we argue that the less efficacious one feels, the more likely they are to enact a passive response, because, you know, why would you do something if you feel as though it's not going to make a difference? So these three appraisals or questions are what we think are the main ones that people ask themselves before, subconsciously, before they come to one of the four response types. But what about the rest of the model? What happens after you've given that response? You know, we've argued that workplace bullying is something that occurs over a long period of time. So we argue that bullying changes over time, therefore bystander responses should change over time. So the next part of our model looks at how people cognitively restructure certain behaviors that are deemed responses that are deemed as less than ideal. As we argued before, active constructive behaviors are seen as the gold standard of responses. But what if you don't enact such a response? What if you enact a passive behavior or a destructive behavior? How do you reconstruct situations after that? So this is where moral disengagement theory comes into our model. And we use moral disengagement theory to explain what happens in bystanders' minds when, for example, we enact those passive and or destructive responses, or our interventions fail. So moral disengagement theory was developed by Albert Bandura. There's a picture of him over there, very famous psychologist. And the theory argues that we have a socialized set of moral standards that we develop as we mature through life. And we want to live as closely to these moral standards as we can, or else we feel very cognitively uncomfortable. However, there are many cases where we do have to act in ways that violate these moral norms. And in order to kind of live with ourselves and to kind of maintain a positive self-image, we engage in moral disengagement mechanisms to reconstruct various aspects of the unethical or norm-violating behavior so that they seem more beneficial to our own self-identity. So, for example, in the UK, we use the term banter a lot. So if you maybe feel uncomfortable for not speaking up when someone is being teased, you may think, well, it wasn't actually that bad. You know, maybe it's just banter. Maybe they were just joking around and it's not actually that serious. So that's a form of moral disengagement known as euphemistic labeling. So moral disengagement theory was originally used to explain kind of these large-scale atrocities like genocide or, you know, large-scale violence. But in the past few decades, there's been a rise of using moral disengagement to explain everyday unethical behaviors, because we, hopefully most of us won't have to take part in these very large-scale atrocities, but we do have regular kind of behaviors that may violate norms, or we see behaviors that violate norms, and we still have to come to terms with them. So moral disengagement theory argues that there are three different types of moral disengagement mechanisms. So I'll go through them very quickly because I don't want to keep you too long. So the first type of moral disengagement mechanism is when you reconstruct the conduct, like the unethical behavior and its consequences. So we argue that that this decreases the incident severity later on. So for example, if I enact maybe a passive destructive response, as I continue to make of the situation, I may think, oh, it wasn't the bullying behavior wasn't actually that bad, or it didn't affect the target that much. So this decreases the extent to which I appraise incident severity. And that subsequently increases future passive destructive behaviors. The second type of moral disengagement mechanism is when you reconstruct victim characteristics. So the second appraisal that I talked about was victim deservingness, so whether or not you attribute responsibility to the target. If you reconstruct the amount of deservingness that the target has, you're obviously going to increase the responsibility you attribute to them. So if you put blame on the victim or dehumanize them, you're less likely to think that the victim did not deserve the treatment. So for example, if I enacted an active destructive bystander response, like I laughed with the target, when the target was being mistreated, I could think, oh, they're this type of person, they're not going to take it personally, or they should probably be used to it. And these types of reconstructions may increase the extent to which I engage in destructive behaviors, because I downplay the harm and I increase the blame I attribute to the victim. Finally, we have moral disengagement mechanisms that reconstruct one's personal agency. So these mechanisms seek to reduce one's felt obligation to act. For example, this may include, diffusing responsibility, thinking, oh, there were so many other people around, it's not just my specific job to do anything, or displacing responsibility onto a specific person or group of people. For example, thinking, well, it's not my job to do anything, it should be human resources or my supervisor. So we argue that these mechanisms will increase subsequent passive behaviors. So hopefully that makes sense, that once you enact a response, bullying will, oftentimes maybe you'll see another act of bullying, or the response to your past behaviors may be different, and these different factors will change the way you view subsequent responses, bullying situations. So finally, I'll move on to the final part of our model. So this is how moral disengagement can affect subsequent acts, subsequent incidents of workplace bullying. And all of this is affected by contextual factors. Okay, so that was my model. I know it was very complicated. Hopefully I'll be able to leave a link to the paper where it'll hopefully make a lot more sense. Right now, I want to talk about the kind of implications and the contributions of this model, because there's so many theories out there. Why do we need another one? So we argue that our paper and the theory that's associated with it helps us understand and synthesize the following points: that workplace bullying is dynamic and it's a social issue. It doesn't occur just between the victim and the bully, and that bystanders who are part of that social group have the capacity to affect the progression of bullying. So we wanted to synthesize these together in a way that past conceptual papers have not done, and offer a neat theoretical framework to explain how the cognitive reasons as to how certain behaviors are enacted. So because this is a theoretical paper, we would like to have empirical research to validate parts of our model. And that is something that I'm seeking to do in my current and future research. So next, I want to talk about the practical implications. And this goes for practitioners and people who have more applied roles. So at the general level, our paper provides kind of the basis of the idea that bystanders should be included in workplace bullying training, that we believe that bystander awareness is very, very important and should be part of any intervention to make people aware that that bullying is a social or group issue and that there is a level of group responsibility for it. Our model also proposes that it's important to target bullying early on, so have active constructive bystander responses early on before norms are set and before moral disengagement becomes very concrete. So early intervention within the zone of constructive intervention is very important. Within a global context, we argue that socio-cultural factors can really affect sense-making, as you can see in our model. And this doesn't refer to just organizational factors, but kind of national cultural factors as well. So it'd be really interesting to look at, for example, how different national cultures view workplace bullying, how they interpret it, and how they treat it as a concept, and kind of what factors can affect sense-making of bystanders. So let's say like a more collectivist culture people in a more collectivist culture may feel less comfortable stepping out and intervening because they don't want to rock the boat or go against what is considered like the group norm. So finding ways to acknowledge that, but also overcome it in a way that is still culturally acceptable is very important. So that is it for my presentation. I know it was quite a bit of information. I've included my contact details in this slide, in my last slide. Thank you very, very much for inviting me. And I hope that this presentation has been interesting. Thank you very much.